everybody, and welcome to my little studio here in Germany. I'm going to talk about wavetable synthesis again, and today I'm going to focus on Unreal Engine Metasound and its new wavetable oscillator that is featured in Unreal Engine 5.1 Preview 2, which is the current version, or at least the most recent version or recent preview version that I have. And I think it was introduced in Preview 1. So, as you know, if you watched my previous parts of the Wavetable synthesis series, I was talking about synthesizer plugins that you can use in audio workstations. If you're new to Unreal Engine Metasounds, it's a modular synth built into the game engine Unreal Engine. So it's just a little part of this incredibly big environment, Unreal Engine. But by itself, it's a full-fledged, really incredibly capable modular synth that you can really do lots of stuff, lots of sound design, different sounds. You can make your own music if you build your own step sequencer or use some form of MIDI input. Yeah, it's a really incredibly extensive and complicated environment, and you can achieve all kinds of sounds. Right now, in the current version 5.0, before the introduction of Wavetable Oscillator, you already had sine, triangle, square, saw oscillators, a noise oscillator, a wave player, and an additive synth. This already gives lots of options, but morphing options for oscillators are a little bit limited, I would say. You have some stuff like phase offset, here audio modulation, like frequency modulation for all the synthesizer. This, of course, is pretty cool. This makes Unreal Engine like an Metasounds like an FM synth. Also, of course, with the wave player, you can play all kinds of wave files, but you can only set loop, start time, loop start, loop duration. So what you can do with the wave files is a little bit limited. Additive synths, of course, are incredibly powerful, but as it is built in Unreal Engine, it is very flexible. You have arrays for harmonic multipliers, amplitudes, phases and panel mounts, but at the same time you have to change these arrays if you want to modulate, if you want to change these values or the sound of the synth on the fly, which can a little bit complicated or cumbersome. So it's pretty cool that they added a wavetable oscillator finally, but it is a little bit different from the synthesizer plugins I've been talking about. The synthesizer plugins have always modulation options to scan or scroll or fade through the different waveforms in one wavetable. In Unreal Engine, the wavetable oscillator just plays every wavetable from left to right based on the frequency. And you can add some phase modulation, but that's it. In terms of option, you can sync it to a trigger, but that's basically it. You have your frequency input, your wavetable input, and your phase modulation input. Of course, in Metasounds, you have lots of different forms of affecting audio signals. So what you can do with a phase modulator here is a lot of different or gives a lot of different options. This is very flexible. And this is very flexible. You can use like LFO inputs. You can combine different LFO signals, can modulate the frequency of one LFO to control another LFO, which controls an audio signal in some form. You can multiply audio signals with float values. And you can use envelopes to control LFO outputs and all kinds of stuff. So it's just one option, just one parameter that can be controlled, but at the same time it gives a lot of room for sound design. And also with the audio output in Metasounds, you can do lots of things. So I would say a lot of sounds you can achieve with other synthesizers can already be done in Metasounds using this new Wavetable oscillator. But at the same time, I have to say that I hope that they will improve on the Wavetable oscillator a little bit, maybe add some morphing options or some more flexible ways to scan through wavetables, because always going from left to right linearly based on the frequency is a little bit boring, at least if you're used to synthesizers such as Serum, Icarus, Vital, or Avenger, or whatever really. You usually have like LFOs or envelopes that you can connect to wavetable position, and therefore you can have jumps in between the wavetable positions, or jump from one frame in position 230 to another frame in position 30, and then go up with a ramp, go down with a curve, and so on. You can really do creative stuff with a wavetable position, and this is a little bit limited. It only is affected by the frequency, and the waveform that you're playing is also affected by the phase modulation. So you have some really nice options. It gives very cool new options for sound design in Metasounds, but at the same time, it leaves a little bit room for possible improvements. Yeah, if you're new to Metasounds, I recommend that you watch some of my intro videos, maybe my beginner series, in which I talk about how to make like a small drum bass loop, and I talk about oscillators, most of the effects, and how to build a basic step sequencer in Metasounds. But for people who just are watching my Wavetable series, I'm going to talk about what I'm doing here in the step sequencer, but very briefly. So when you start the sound here, and this gives out a trigger. Wait 1 second, I think, yeah, I've connected this wrong here. I'm going to talk about this later, but just so the sound doesn't stress you out so much. And you see I have the exact note sequence that I also use in many of my other videos in this Wavetable series. Very simple sequence, of course. It's not something you want to put in a track. It's just that your ears don't get too extremely bored by always playing the same note. And for Metasounds, it's a little bit more complicated to use a MIDI keyboard. I'm gonna talk about it in some video in the future, probably in combination with like a synthesizer I'm working on, which also receives MIDI input. So it's no problem to connect a MIDI controller to Metasounds, but you have to do some work in blueprints. So today I'm just using the step sequencer to keep things very simple. And when you push here play, you see first time you hit it, this one fires, but then it doesn't fire anymore. It just fires one time when you hit play, or when Metasound is activated in the context of a game or an application you are doing. Then this one-time trigger starts the trigger repeater, and this gives out repeated hits based on the period it receives from this BPM to seconds module, which is based on a BPM input. You can also just put BPM in here, but here you can change it a little bit, make it faster or slower. And based on this value, BPM value, and the beat multiplier and divisions, you get like a time value, and this tells the trigger repeater how often to fire, or with what frequency to fire, give out the trigger. So you see here, gets a little bit slower when you decrease the BPM. So every time this repeater hits, you get you receive a trigger here in your trigger counter. This is what I call the sequencer core. It's composed of a trigger counter, trigger compare, and some get nodes, and very important, the step sequencer array. So every time the trigger counter is triggered, it gives out a value here. This is translated into integer, so it can be used as an index for this get float array. So every time this hits, this node gets a value from here. First time index 0, this, and so on. This value is then compared in this trigger compare module with the value 0. And if it's greater than 0, you can also use different logical operators here. But if you use greater than, it gives out a trigger here when you use the true pin if this value is higher than or greater than 0. So here it will not give out a trigger, you see. When this fires, this doesn't always fire. And this is the case when it receives the 0 value from here or from here. All the other values here are transformed or translated. First, there's a get node that gets the value from here based on the index it receives from here, but only when it's triggered from the trigger compare node. And then this element also have, you can change the octave here, but this element, octave is added, and then it goes into a MIDI to frequency node. So this MIDI value here that you get from the sequencer, for instance 48, is translated into a MIDI frequency that can be used with your oscillator. It gives out a nice note at the correct frequency. And I also have another note here. This is used when you have a very big wavetable, which is usually read in synthesizer plugins such as Serum or Excourse as 256 waveforms. So here I play a single waveform. I don't need this. But when I play a Wavetable, as Metasounds counts it, but as I said, it's played in a linear fashion. So when I play this Wavetable, it's 256 times the length of this these single waveforms. So I have to divide by 256. Yeah, so when I use this big wavetable here, I have to connect this node here. And you see now you have a slight morphing effect. And this is the same you would get if you use wait a second. If you use here like a ramp oscillator on the wavetable position in Serum, then it will also scan through in a linear fashion. And if you set this to the same rate, it will, as the frequency it's playing here, it will scan through it at the same time and give out the same sound basically. Here's my Metasounds. Yeah, so that's basically it for the step sequencer. This just leads to the simple note sequence that you see here, or the other way around. And yeah, this wavetable oscillator is basically the core of the wavetable synthesis in Metasounds. So every time this is triggered, I also synced it to the trigger. You see, the table doesn't start in the beginning every time if I don't use the sync. If I use this, it starts in the beginning. Sounds the same every time, no matter what frequency you play it. Of course the note is different, but the waveforms that are played are the same like that. Yeah, every time this is triggered, it plays the wavetable it gets from the wavetable bank and this table index. So here I only have one wavetable in this wavetable bank. So when I set it to 0, it plays this wavetable. Yeah, and as I said, it plays it from start to finish without any way to bring a curve or repetition or reverse section or anything like that inside. It only plays the wavetable. So if I connect the other wavetable and I don't use this division, I use this division node, you see you don't hear much because this is played very slowly and it's not a good sound. So I have to connect this to the frequency. And you see it sounds very similar. It's like this first part of the 256 waveforms that are inside of this wavetable. I set this to maximum, so it really gives me the best quality. I'll go back for this for a second to show you what happens when you set it to a lower value. Go back here, start again. And you see even at 4096 the sound quality decreases drastically. So if you use a long table, if you import something from like a synthesizer plugin like Serum, always go to the maximum. Unreal Engine tells you that this is very memory intensive if a source file is large, which of course is the case. But if you want a good quality, you have to do it like that. Before that I can reduce it a little bit more. So oh, there it doesn't even work. So you see the waveform also changes. At this point it breaks apart. We just get a ramp. So let's go back to maximum for this. And you hear the slight modulation in tone that you also could hear in all the other synthesizers I showed you here. As I said, it's like a simple rave in a synthesizer plugin such as Serum. But let's do something more interesting. Go back to the wavetable bank with 4 waveforms. Right now you don't hear the modulation because it only plays this first waveform, as you can hear. But as soon as you connect an LFO to the table index, you can hear that it really scans through these 4 waveforms, and it doesn't sound bad. So this is really a practical way to use this get node to perform something like wavetable position changes in a more flexible way as compared to using a full wavetable in the wavetable oscillator. Yeah, so already with these 2 nodes you can build something like a part of the oscillator here in Serum, where the wavetable position is based not necessarily on a simple ramp, but you can put anything from I don't have a sine wave in the presets, but yeah, you can put like a curve, and depending on the LFO input or the envelope input that you give it, you can combine LFOs and envelopes and do all kinds of crazy stuff. At this point, of course, I'm using a single LFO with a sine wave, but you can combine this LFO with another LFO, you can combine these 2 LFOs with like an envelope generator and add, subtract, divide, and so on, and base the table index on all these operations you're doing here. You can also, which is very cool, you have a Wavetable envelope generator. So this also takes a wavetable, but it gives out float values instead of audio values, and you can connect this to the table index. Connect this to play. Maybe I should multiply it. Yeah, now you can hear it. So now the wavetable selection is based on the input it gets from another wavetable. Oh, this is one wavetable, it's a little bit. Yeah, I think you can hear it, what I'm talking about. Of course, this doesn't necessarily sound very good. But you can use wavetables to basically modulate anything in Metasounds now. And this is pretty great because before that you had simple LFOs and envelope generators. Now you have wavetable envelopes. So you can use any kind of waveform you can create to modulate any parameter in Metasounds, basically, which opens up crazy possibilities. Yeah, so that's the Wavetable core. You have your Wavetable oscillator, you have your get wavetable from bank, you have your wavetable banks, in which you can put either single cycle waveforms and you use the table index, or you can also, of course, use longer waveforms and still use the table index. And you might want to add some kind of modulation for the table index, especially if you're using multiple single cycle waveforms like I do here. If you use one, of course, it doesn't make any sense to modulate the table index, because only at index 0 you have a real waveform. So another thing I want to talk about is what I would call the morphing option in the Wavetable oscillator of Unreal Engine Metasound. This is here phase modulation. Let's connect it to a simple sine wave first. And it takes an audio input, but the nice thing about Metasound is you can combine and translate most inputs. So here you can take a float input, for instance, and multiply it with the audio input. Or here you take the wavetable input, multiply it with an audio envelope, and so on. So let's listen to how the phase modulation sounds. First we have to and you hear very strong effects. Of course, if you want to make interesting sounds, you don't necessarily want to use the same modulation over the whole time the sound is played here, the wavetable or waveform is played. So you might want to add an envelope, so multiply the signal you get from the sine wave, multiply it by an envelope, and connect this to the phase modulation. And what you get You see the envelope fades in and out. Make this a little bit shorter. Yeah, I set it to loop, so sometimes it overlaps a little bit, I think. Of course, you can play around with the frequency of the sine wave and with the strength. So the sine wave, as I said, is multiplied by this strength parameter, and here you can decide about how strong the effect is. Yeah, so there's a lot of fun you can have with face modulation in Metasound. But let's try out something different. Let's check it how it sounds when you only connect the envelope. Here you see it's just a single peak that we give it. So the face gets a little bump, so to say. But that's it. And now we are using this waveform to phase modulate the waveform that is taken from the scrolling through these 4 waveforms. Of course, we can also add an LFO here and scroll through this waveform, but I don't think that's not necessary at the moment. And of course, we can also multiply these signals. Yeah, and depending, of course, on what values you select, the sound changes drastically. If you don't make this an input, you can modulate all the parameters here in Metasounds. So, if you have a float parameter, you just put in an LFO. For instance, you can put a float envelope into it too. And if you have an audio parameter, it takes input from oscillators, so like a sine oscillator or the Wavetable oscillator. And here, of course, for the float parameters, you can also use the new Wavetable envelope. I think this is much too fast. Yeah, now you hear a stronger effect. Maybe let's modulate this too. Let's just have the same here. Minimum value is 1, maximum value -1, maximum value is 1 here. Of course you can change this, I really like. have extreme strength here. Gets multiplied by 10 at some points. So it's a very strong effect. So what you can do in this case is you just put in another multiply node. You can use map range, but multiply works too. Oh, 1000, that should be nice. And switch this down to, yeah, put it back to 1. So you have extreme changes in frequency. Maybe go a little bit lower. You don't want to overdo it. Actually, like the higher volume better. Set this to looping. Of course, you can also base these times on the LFO here, so it's completely in sync with step sequencing you're doing. Oh, let's go even higher. Check out one. Okay, now it gets a little bit crazy. Let's do this from 0. Yeah, as you can see, there's a lot of fun to be had with all these modulation options. It's really crazy, and this morphing option in the Wavetable oscillator, I'm sure will be a lot of fun to play with. But as I already mentioned, maybe the Wavetable oscillator gets improved a little bit and gets closer to something like you have in Serum or in Arranger with all the different morphing options. That would be cool. But at the same time, you can do a lot of stuff just by influencing how the phase modulation here works, what audio signal you give into the phase modulation, and with, of course, with this audio signal you get from here, you can do all kinds of transformations. So Unreal Engine is really very flexible, and you can already do a lot of stuff with this new Wavetable oscillator. So I'm really happy that it's included now. Looking forward to the final release of Unreal Engine 5.1. Maybe they have some surprises for us with regard to how it works and what options and yeah, what flexibility it has. Let's go even higher for a second. I want to read it. Oh no, it's way too much. Oh no, still getting something. Yeah, that's it for today. I'm going to talk more about Metasounds, of course, and more about the Wavetable oscillator, maybe come up with some nice patches to show you. And if you have any problems to understand this, any questions or any ideas for new videos, maybe some sounds you want to recreate, feel free to comment it. I'm going to try my best to make some interesting videos. And thank you very much for listening, and hopefully see you next time. Bye bye.